Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the second part of deliberations, where we'll be focusing today on schools and the budget. And I'll go over, and just as a reminder, for some ground rules as we move forward. However, we do have a presentation tonight from our superintendent and his team around schools, just so that we can get a better understanding of some of the potential changes that are in this budget book for this year. And I'll keep reminding our listening audience that we have participatory budgeting tool on our website at rcsdk12.org/budget. It will bring you to the tool, and it will bring you to all of the materials for tonight's meeting and ongoing board question logs, where the board members have submitted questions to the administration in regards to questions that they have that you may not see us having here tonight, because lots of questions have already been submitted for answers. But we do make that public to everyone in the community to go and review and see some of the questions and answers that are being asked. Perhaps they might be some of the questions you yourself might have. So tonight's deliberation, I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Peluso, our superintendent, so he can get started, and then I'll just do a reminder of some groundkeeping rules. Thank you.
Thank you, Vice President Brown. So just before we head into the school profiles and the section of the school profiles, there are many items that impact what you see on the school profile sheets. First, we base our staffing on projected enrollments and numbers that we're projecting for that school to have, and that's how staffing's done based on ratio. Well, that was the best opening I ever gave. I'm sorry you missed it. I'll do take two. It's good. This one be so. Thank you. Thank you to Vice President LeBron. I just wanted to talk a little bit about school profiles and what we're going to be looking at and reviewing today. So when we're in a school profile review, there's a lot of factors that impact the numbers that you're seeing. We base staffing on projected enrollment, and projected enrollment is we then use ratios for staffing based on that projected enrollment. So pluses and minuses all come from those projected enrollment. We also have a allocation we give to schools called the total allocation per pupil unit. And that is money that I will have Chief Financial Officer Farr go over in a moment, but that's money that the schools then make some decisions on where they're going to put the allocation that they receive. And also unique to this budget is we are moving some positions that were in ARP and CURSA back to general fund, so that we start to bring back some of the positions that we've had. So in there's some positions that will be moving from general fund. So that also kind of creates variances in what you may see. But I'm going to turn it over to our Chief Financial Officer so that he can give a little bit further explanation of this before we enter the dialogue.
Thank you, Superintendent Peluso. First of all, you should have in front of you hard copy. You should have in front of you a hard copy of a memo I just drafted today. And so I apologize for you're just getting this information. But as we got deeper into the process, it just became apparent to me that there was a lot of knowledge base that we could share as you look at a school profile that would help understand that document, not only for the board, but the community as well. So if you go to the second page, you'll see there's two-page write-up on what we call total allocation per pupil unit, or TAPU is the acronym. And there's a couple parts to this. One is how it's calculated. So this is a calculation that's based on projected enrollment that each school then is given. And I detail here how it's calculated. There's a base allocation for each student. Then there's a supplemental allocation for special ed students, and a supplemental allocation for English language learner students as well. So those are calculated by the budget office, They are put on a worksheet. This is basically last fall, and earlier in the budget process. A worksheet is sent to each school, and we allocate out up front, at that point, 90% of the calculation. And the reason why we only do 90% is we're holding back 10% because we reconcile what we're doing in the budget process to what actually occurs at the start of school. So when we get to the start of school, we'll look at the actual enrollment versus the projected. We'll recalculate and then add or subtract as appropriate. So eventually it all gets allocated. But in the initial budget process, that 90%, each school gets their calculation, it's sent to them. Then the principal has the discretion to allocate those funds as appropriate and needed for their specific school. So this is totally within their realm to figure out. And I list in this memo here, I list categories that they can use, and just to give you an idea of what kind of things that might occur. But what happens is every year the principal can reallocates, right? So what you'll see in the school profiles, you'll see a 22-23 column that represents what the principal allocated, and then in 23-24 you'll see the allocation for that year. And there are variances. And those variances then are the principal making changes. And there are some things that a principal may fund that are non-recurring, kind of things that they want to do that are once and done. And so once they've done it, then they allocate money for something else. But generally, the bulk of the resources are intended to go for instructional supplies, and that's what they are used for. We're also making some budget changes that I note in the second page of the TAPU document. We are pulling back some things to the central budget that we felt were creating some inequities. So while the calculation of the TAPU is equitable, right? It's based on students, and we have weightings for special ed and ELL students. What their obligations are were different. So, for example, in the past, if you were a school with a pool, the principal, the school had to pay for the pool supplies out of their TAPU. And in looking at that, we didn't feel that was appropriate. Certainly not equitable, because not everybody has a pool, and it's costly. So we pulled that back, and we are funding those pool supplies centrally. Similar kind of thing, we're making some changes. We talked about some accounting changes last week. We're making changes regarding printing and postage, and then also lunch monitors. So in the past, principals could use their TAPU to pay for lunch monitors, but some principals may not do that. They may use their own staff. They may do it themselves, assistant principals. And it's just creating this variance. So we pulled back the allocation for that too. So we're covering that cost centrally as well. So it's still costing the district. It's still being budgeted. It's just it's showing up in the central office budget. So that's TAPU. If you go to the next page, there's a page about definitions of function categories. So when you look at a page, a school profile page, and you'll see on the left side, you'll see all these categories, functions, starting with facilities, going down to transportation. And so we thought it would be good to help define what is going under those categories. Some are self-evident, but some are not so clear. So for example, the supervision line on a school profile includes principals, or principal, vice principals, secretarial staff, SSOs. And so we're trying to provide you a definition to give you kind of a roadmap of what kind of things. So if you look and you see a change in that category, then you have an idea of what is changing. And also there's a distinguishment here that I'm just getting familiar with too. There's category programs for students with disabilities, which would be special education, and then there's category English language learners. And so if you're a bilingual teacher, you should show up in English language learners. If you're a bilingual special education teacher, you'll show up in the programs for students with disabilities. And I make that distinction because as you go through and you look and you say, well, wait a minute, they have a large ELL program, but I don't see the relative dollars here. And it's because they may have a large program, but they may have a large special education program at the same school combined with the bilingual program. So those are the kind of things that get a little nuanced, but I thought it'd be helpful for you to be exposed to that and see. And then the last page, specific to the 23-24 budget, is, and I'm trying to put some detail to provide a better explanation on this, of funding for positions that a year ago were shifted from general fund to federal stimulus. That was a temporary solution to balancing our budget last year, and ultimately we've got to bring those positions back in 23-24, and then ultimately 24-25. We've got to bring the remaining back, or whatever's left, positions that might be eliminated at that time. We started that process in 23-24. I tried to kind of divide up some categories in half, like 50% in 23-24, 50% 24-25. So what you'll see here, there was two categories that really stick out in the school profiles. One is custodians and one is building substitute teachers. So think of this, that the staffing hasn't changed. Like if you're at a school and you have 3 custodians, those 3 custodians have been there, they're going to be there. The funding has shifted around. And so as we're shifting back, and we actually list here the actual schools where we moved people back and we placed them in a budget. So when you look at like school 9, under facilities, you will see an increase. And that increase is because we shifted resources back into the general fund. So it doesn't mean we didn't add a custodian at that school, we shifted the funding source. So hopefully that makes sense. And the same thing with building substitute teachers as well. Those are included in the teaching regular school staffing. Those are large numbers because that's where all the regular teachers reside. But we added a 1.0 position for schools that have a general funded building substitute teacher. So that will cause an increase in that line as well. So there's a lot of moving parts, and it's confusing, and that's why I thought I'd at least try to make an attempt to put it all, at least some of this on paper for you to digest. Again, I apologize for the lateness of getting it to you, but hopefully it'll be helpful to you for this process, and then actually this should be helpful in future years as well.
Commissioner Powell?
You're referring to the budget changes where schools are no longer responsible for. In particular, the printing and postage. Your explanation sounds, and maybe it's because I misunderstood you last week, but it sounds backward from what you were describing as the print shop as being something of a revenue center and charging back. Are we still charging back for some functions but not all?
Yeah, we are changing the chargeback process. Currently, in this year, we charge back and it generates internal revenue, as it were. We're gonna stop doing that process. The print shop has a fully funded budget, and what we are going to do, though, is we are still going to be accounting for usage, just to track to know who's spending how much and stuff like that. But we're going to be taking that centrally. So if somebody starts spending a lot of money, we'll address it at that time.
Right. So, for instance, if a school is responsible for instructional supplies, but finds that they can circumvent that by having the print shop mass produce similar or identical instructional supplies, so that they don't have to pay for them from a publisher, you may find your print shop is being overburdened.
Well, right. So, but that could occur anyways. So what we're going to do is we're going to shift accountability to track, so that right now the system is designed is trying to control spending through a budget allocation. And what we want to do is have people spending appropriately and control it through controlled behavior, so that if somebody gets way out of whack, then we'll have to address it, right? And because we have the past history as well, so we're still going to be tracking what people are doing. We just want to avoid all the paperwork that goes with people submitting and getting charged back, and all the internal processing to try to make it more efficient. But it requires us to manage the process.
As always, because
Yeah.
if you give people an opportunity to game a system,
Yep.
they will game a system.
Well, I think people will try, for sure. So it's up to us to manage back appropriately to make sure that we're controlling and people get an idea of how far you can push the envelope.
Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner Powell. Commissioner Simmons?
Yeah, just a follow-up question. I appreciate that there is some funding that the central will take over to allow schools to have more autonomy in other spaces. And to that point, I know you've mentioned, Mr. Farr, that I'm losing my train of thought, forgive me, that some of the printing, for example, you'll be monitoring to check for usage. So if there are some flags that come up, you can address it as such. Is there something that you're going to put in place so that it's not so reactive, and maybe a criteria, not something that controls every little decision they make, but some form of a criteria where schools will know what's expected ahead of time before that
Right.
flag comes up?
Right. I just described the process right now, and we have a really robust print shop, by the way. And we have a lot of expensive equipment, and we can do a lot of good stuff. But what we want to do is establish some kind of basic criteria, kind of a baseline standard. Like, okay, everybody gets the standard. And because otherwise, right now, left to their own device, people are like, oh, I want this and that. I want glossy, and, so. We have to set some criteria of what the expectations are for what you do through the print shop. Also, people people are not necessarily limited, even though I'd like it to be, to use our print shop. People can go out and if they put in a requisition, they can go out and use an external source as well. But so there's a lot of systems that have to be put in place for these changes. Yeah.
Thank you, Commissioner Simmons. Thank you, Farr. So a couple of just reminders that we're going to do round robin. I just have a few announcements to make afterwards, but we're going to go round robin, 3 questions. So each commissioner will have a chance to ask a question regarding the school profiles and anything you see in there. Hopefully this accompaniment that was created. I can't even speak tonight myself. This document that was created to accompany this will help answer some additional questions around some of the coding and stuff in there. And then any additional questions that we can't get to tonight can go into the board question log. As a reminder, the board question log for the budget deliberations is public, and the public can go see our questions, and they can also see the answers from administration. I also want to point out that Dr. Nelms and Dr. Jallo are both joining us tonight via Zoom, so I will be looking to them, and if there's any questions or comments that they want to chime in on. Commissioner Patterson and Commissioner Adams are participating in the Rochester City School District's annual storytelling project that's happening tonight at East, and that is where kids from all grades, all schools, come together and do an oracle competition and tell a story, and it's a wonderful, just unfortunately happens to be in the same budget deliberation night, and I do want to thank our Dr. Miller, who went on my behalf tonight, and so our Chief of Human Resources is unfortunately not joining us tonight because he went in place of having 3 commissioners down on the budget deliberation. So I just want to put that out there. And I want them to be supporting our students. So I appreciate our commissioners being there tonight and the rest of us being here tonight for budget deliberations. And I also just want to quickly give a shout out to School 22, who's also having a competition tonight with the Simon School, and the kids are pitching their business proposal ideas to the Simon School with the hopes that one of those kind of get picked up and funded, sort of like a mini Shark Tank. Another cool competition that unfortunately none of us are able to be there tonight because of budget deliberations, but we wish all of our students good luck in both competitions tonight. With that, I'm going to get started, and I want to acknowledge that our student rep is here tonight, so welcome, David. And our parent rep, Deveth, is also here with us. For those who may be seeing the 2 additional folks asking questions, they will get to participate as well. And so with that, I will start with... Oh, I'm sorry. President Elliott has a few questions around the handout, and then I'll get started. And when I get started, I'll start with our student rep, then our parent rep, and work our way around. Okay, thank you. President Elliott.
Thank you, Vice President. So the question I have, last year when the allocations, is it on? When the allocations were made, and while those allocations were made, they, in the finance department, they were not allowed to spend the money. So my concern is that if the funding is allocated, but they've got a stop in the finance department, you know, why allocate this money and why put those limits on those, and it happened in the board office, and it's happened throughout the schools that there was some complaints, and this was not, let me just say, Mr. Farr, was not under your leadership, but that was a decision that was made under the previous leadership, that while the money was allocated, schools and other departments were not able to spend as freely as they needed to spend, even when the money was allocated. Is that, I'm hoping that that's not the same process that we're going through. Maybe that's you, Mr. Superintendent, that can respond to that.
I'm stealing the mic. Is that how you know I'm going to respond? So I'll start, and then I will give it to the CFO. So one of the recommendations, I believe, that had come out from previous years was to cease spending earlier in the school year, right? And making, having schools, departments be disciplined in terms of making decisions on how they spend their money at some point in time. Previously, we've had a culture of, in March or April, looking at our budget and saying, I have $10,000, let's stock up on Post-its and pens, right? And then we come in, we see Post-its and pens everywhere. And so those are things that we're trying to make sure that people are more disciplined in their spending and more planned in their spending. We're not trying to control it. We're stopping when it was spent so that we could reconcile and close books. And that was a recommendation that it came a few years ago under once again, a previous CFO, but I will, if there's anything else I missed, I'll let Sean continue.
Yeah, I'm not sure on the past history, but I will say that the allocations that are made to schools, that the principals, that they should have the latitude to spend that money. Certainly, and I don't know how the previous CFO operated, but I'm not inserting myself in how they spend their TAPU funds. Speaking to there is a year-end fiscal cutoff that has been set at February 15th. That's a lot earlier than I really think it should be, but it has a lot to do with processing of paper at the district. It takes a substantial amount of time and longer than, so hopefully we're going to retool some of that. But what we have to do is ultimately we need some cutoff where people, the requisitions stop coming in and we can process and order and receive and pay the bills and close out the fiscal year. I will say it is a culture shift, and I'll be emphasizing this, internally. My expectation is that when we start our budget July 1, and if you're a principal and you have an allocation for whatever they put in, that in the summertime is you're ready to go. You've got requisitions in, you're ordering stuff, you're getting supplies, you're getting materials, you have your program set so that you can get it in time for the start of school. So I'm used to a timeline where people by October they've spent all their money because they had a plan for it, and you want to encourage that because you want people to you want the money to be spent for the benefit of the students, and if it's spent in April, it's now you're talking about a couple months benefit versus if it was spent in the summer and whatever you're spending it on. Now things change, and there are exceptions, by the way, because we have things that people do, programs, events that happen towards the end of school year, and we don't want to constrain or discourage that. So it's while we have a general stop of expenditures, it's not a full stop. That there are exceptions to that because obviously we're operating schools and we want programs to continue and we want events to happen. So
yeah, that was going to be my follow-up question.
Yeah.
Right.
There are exceptions, and the way it's drafted is the approval goes to me, but it can, I can actually, I should be working to delegate that so I don't have to, because there's just general stuff. We're still operating schools. There's still events and programs like we were talking about. There's programs going on tonight, right? And you've got to prepare for it. You need to buy stuff and prepare, and we don't want to constrain that. So, but the real stop is think of if somebody, not so much the TAPU dollars, but if somebody was putting in to process a contract, that's where that February 15th comes in, because they need to start the process so it can get through, get approved. And that's really kind of late in the game anyways, because by the time it got approved, there isn't much time left in the school year. So I'm also pushing, kind of over time to people to get their paperwork in earlier in the year, like I said, during the summer, so that or actually people are putting in contracts right now for next year, which is what really should be happening, so that by the time the board has seen it and approved it, we're ready to do it and for the start of school, and then the students can benefit at that school for get the benefit of that program or consultant or whatever for the whole year, not part of the year.
Okay, and then just one last question. The projected pupil enrollment, what was that? Do you have that information that will also be included?
Yeah.
I'd like to see that data.
Yeah, we have a big chart, Need to do some final refining on that, but we'll get that out to the board as well.
Yeah, because if you're saying that you basing these numbers on projected pupil enrollment, then it's important for us to, I think, to see the data, so.
Well, generally, enrollment is going down, so it varies by location. And it's just projected, by the way, so we're doing some projections for next school year. We'll reconcile that once we get into the school year, then we'll reconcile the actual enrollment versus what we projected.
So I do want to piggyback on that, because that is an area that I think we could enhance our budget book as we move forward. Historically, we've kept beds data in there, and which shows a year later, right? So when we're looking at the beds data that's in this book, we're looking not even at the 22-23 beds data, we're looking at the 21-22 beds data, and we're right now projecting for 23-24. So we have some lag here with our data. I did send in the board letter this week a projected enrollment across buildings so that you get a sense of where the numbers are. And we will include that in our final budget book as well as a projected enrollment document along with other preface documents that we want to include so that everyone has that full awareness.
All right, thank you, thank
you. Just to add to that, the final budget book, each school profile is being modified to add the 22-23 beds data, the actual, and then the projected that we've used for 23-24. So that'll be each page is being revised to incorporate that data.
All right, thank you, thank you.
All right, so round one, I'm going to turn it over to our student to ask a question. When you're asking a question, just as a reminder to all commissioners and our parent liaison included, please, our parent rep, sorry, please include the page number so that our staff can pull it up for our listening audience watching and they can follow along. Thank you.
All right, so I was looking at page 83. But also like page 84 as well when I was looking at the extracurricular activities part of the school profile, and I saw that in the 2023, for this year, there was no extracurricular activity fund there, and I was a little confused. I know that that's for the club advisors to get their stipends. So this year did no club advisor get their stipends, or I'm confused on why there's like no number there.
Yeah, so the sheet that we distributed, if you go to the page that says school profile funding categories and extracurricular activities, so you'll see it is stipends for club advisors. We are, I didn't put it in my summary sheet, but we are decentralizing that. So previously that's been held centrally. So we did some allocations based on historical spending. So that's why for early college and SOTA, you'll see there's nothing for this year and then amounts for next year. And so the funding hasn't per se changed. We're now allocating it out to the schools to use, and that's not necessarily it's not a full allocation as well. So we have a hold back on that as well in case, because this is the first year we're doing it. So if people need some more, more or less, we have funds to work with. But that's why the change.
Thank you.
Question, actually. I just want to point out, because I know we use terminologies like decentralizing and centralizing, and folks listening may not understand that terminology. It just means that those monies were controlled here at central office, and now schools can directly control how that is allocated out versus sending it to us saying, here's what you have. They get to see it and control it locally, if you will. Tibe? Page 78.
Good evening. how are the school ELL allocation determined? How many are instructional and how many are staff? Why do some schools like Lower Monroe have no allocations and Monroe Lower has 107 ELL students?
Yeah, let me answer that one as well. What we're finding as we go through the detail here, at least I've been spending a lot of time with Terry, our executive director for the budget, going through detail, and what we're finding in this case, and this is the exact case where it has English language learners and there's no allocation listed there. What we're finding in the detail is that the positions exist, the program is there, that they're not they're not in the right classification. In this case, they're ending up in the regular teacher allocation. That is not a new issue, because if you look, you'll see in the current year, there's nothing funded. So what it means is for some period of time, those positions, when there's codes, like a position has a long string of code, how it's, shows up in the system, that at some point in time, and it may be a long time as we're finding these out, it wasn't coded correctly. So we're going to work, in fact, I think we identified that this particular issue earlier today. And so when we find these errors, we have to go forward and clean them up. But I believe at Monroe Lower, there's actually 3 bilingual teachers at Monroe, Lower Monroe, right? Yeah.
Dee, go ahead.
That is correct. There are three bilingual teachers and SO teachers. It's just coded under, they're just listed under regular teacher.
Yeah, and I will say that as we've gone through this, I guess with more detail than we have in the past, because otherwise we would have, these things should have stuck out before, that we're finding issues to clean up. Generally, like 98, 99% of these things are correct, but as we go through all the detail of it, we're finding positions that exist, but they're placed in a different category, so apologize for that.
Just to clarify, Monroe Lower has 3 bilingual and 4 SO teachers on staff.
Commissioner Powell?
Thank you. I'm trying to understand how, I know there's been a conscious effort to increase the number of counselors and in our buildings, and I'm trying to understand where I will find those in the budget book. I've compared, for instance, most of the guidance line only has a very marginal increase, but in some cases, like page 79 and page 82, there's significant enough change to represent an increase or a decrease of 1 FTE. So it's at least a 2-part question. Number 1, are the counselors in the civil service line, because they're not certified teachers? That's part 1. And will I find them in the guidance line in each of the school profile pages? That's part 2. And finally, to the extent that we're increasing the counselors in the buildings, how can we be sure that that it's actually going to provide more time for students who are walking in with a crisis? Or is there some other mechanism for handling students who are looking for crisis attention?
So I'm going to have Deputy Superintendent take the response to those situations.
I expected you would.
Thank you.
Is it on? Okay. Yeah. There are multiple people who are able and who are trained to respond to students' need in crisis. So we have contract partners like Center for Youth in most of our schools, right, that are able to do reflection room, do some crisis intervention. We employ a little over 100 social workers who are also able to respond, school counselors, school psychologists. In each building, we have a crisis team that includes the school nurse and multiple folks in the building who are also able to provide, and some trained paraprofessionals, crisis intervention for students. So our counselors play a role in that, but so do other staff members.
But from a budget perspective, where will I find, as I'm looking at the page, am I gonna find those support people primarily in the guidance line? Well, the school nurse isn't going to be.
Right, so, I'm sorry.
Go ahead.
School counselors will be the guidance line. Social workers are found in the social services line, so it's throughout the budget. I'm sure Sean can speak to that better than I can.
I guess the root of my question is, because we've been increasing counselors, a lot of the time that's spent in certified counselors is taken up doing IEP hearings and other like tasks designated by the state. But to the extent that we're adding personnel to make room for, student career counseling and emergency, crisis counseling, how exactly is that? Is that being managed at the school level, or is it being managed at the central office level? Are we pushing FTEs into buildings on demand? How are we handling that exactly?
Good question. So yes to both. There's building level support, and when building level support is overwhelmed or needs additional supports, we're able to deploy people from central office, like our crisis response team. If we needed, our TEAC team members. So both in the building level, folks are trained to provide that service. So in terms of school counselors, we insured school counselors not just in our middle school and high school, but also in our elementary school. So the school counselors in the elementary schools do a lot of that crisis prevention intervention work. And as you get into middle school and high school, focusing on career, interest, and inventory, making sure that students, are up to par with their credits, taking the right classes, along with providing mental health counseling if needs be. But they partner again with the building social worker, with the contract supports in the building, with the school psychologist, right, to make sure the needs of the students are met in that way. So the school social workers have the responsibility of providing the IEP psychological counseling, and that's why we increased that area a lot, so that folks are not spending all day, right, doing that there's enough of the sharing of the caseload so that they could do crisis work. They can do non-IEP student mental health supports. As you know, we have partners in our schools through University of Rochester, through Rochester General, who also provide those additional mental health supports.
So, and again, I'll focus on the question of the FTEs. Am I going to find those under civil service, since they're not
No.
certificated teachers?
All our counselors and social workers, there's people who are in the RTA, and so they do not, they're going to show up under the teacher section. And but what you'll see is you don't have we haven't provided the data for 23, 24, but as enrollment declines and we reallocate staffing fresh each year, so based on the enrollment projections and the staffing calculation behind that, so you could see So as enrollment declines in a school, you'll see a reduction, maybe not a full position, but you'll see reductions in staffing for that school in relation to whatever the contractual relationships are, or whatever our staffing goals are. So.
Thank you, Commissioner Powell. Commissioner Simmons?
Good evening. Is this thing on? Can you hear me? No? Okay, I can't hear myself, but, psychological services, just, can you help me or point them out where they're located in the, like, where are those funds being allocated from or pulled from?
Well, let me start with, so that was the category psychological services. If you went through all the school profiles,
Yeah.
you'll see it only got used in, it's only in two places, two profiles, East Lower and East Upper. And this is another one of these things where that's how, these are for school psychologists at each location, and it's how it's being categorized at East. Otherwise, they're in, I don't know where they, so I'm not sure where the psychologists reside.
So psychologists sit centrally in our budget, right? So
Yeah.
East Upper and East Lower have them because East Upper and East Lower is their central, right, essentially. So, Desiree Chief Richmond could speak a little bit more about
So they're
psych.
specific to East, you're saying, and then we have something different, or?
Yes, because East holds theirs in East's budget, we hold ours centrally in our budget.
Gotcha, where
Yep.
are ours?
Special education budget.
Okay.
Yeah, special education.
Okay. And then, the occupational education, I don't see that across the board.
So occupational and physical therapists are also in the special education budget.
The
The
occup-
only positions like related services
Mhm.
that are in the school budgets are the speech and language therapists and the special education teachers.
Okay.
Our other
Occupational
support
education in
services-
here says CTE, though.
Yeah,
Oh, okay.
yeah.
Yeah,
This is
so-
a different use of that term.
Yeah.
Yeah, so, if you look at, you'd look at Edison, and I think maybe there's a few other places, but it's for places that have a technology teacher and then CTE teachers, which is Edison.
So I want to clear, occupational therapy, OT-PT,
Mm-hmm.
is different than occupational education.
Right, I understand
Yeah,
that. Did
yeah,
I say
yeah.
occupational therapy?
Yes, I think
Okay.
you said
I
occupational
misspoke.
therapy. Okay,
It's
no,
a long evening, then
no,
I, because I
that's-
meant occupation. I was so confused, Desiree, because I'm like, occupational education. That's perfect, thank you.
Yes,
So I meant to say occupational education, that was on me. And then, thank you for that clarity. And then lastly, what was I looking at? The ELL. So here's an example on page 86, or is it 86? Page 84. School of the Arts, for example, such a large school population. And then, of course, there's no dollars showing for ELL. And then when I look, I also see that, there's maybe 35 ELL students for a school that serves a little over 1,000 students. And I'm just wondering, that's a wondering I guess I have, is so many students, but so little English language learners in the population. And then we have, other schools that have such a saturated number of English language learners, and I'd like to better understand that.
So that is a very good question about equity in terms of all things, right? Special education numbers, E&L placements. And these are some of the things that we tried to address some of the placement stuff with changing our managed choice policy as well with, we've brought that forth with like a 15% holdback of seats so that when people come in, that some schools that are full, they can't accept new kids. But we need to address our equity in schools on students with disabilities as well as L population as a whole systemic thing so that not one, and this is how we end up in receivership in some of our schools, right? And how we end up in high accountability in some of our schools because schools are, that fill because of either selection processes or some other criteria, then other schools have the other students, very mobile students that come back and forth, and makes it really hard to establish that strong cohort, which is, we've talked about having kids enter in ninth grade and remain with you through. That's really what helps you stabilize cohorts for graduation. So that is an equity problem that we have to look at as a district in terms of how we're placing kids and how we're programming kids across the district. And I know that Des and her team were looking at special ed placements and how they place around the districts. And it's hard because some seats will then be taken from other students, right? You know, that have some desires, strong desires, but that needs to be a priority for us as a team here to make sure that we have equity across all buildings with L students and special education students.
Thank you.
Commissioner Malloy.
Thank you. That's a perfect segue, talking about equity between our buildings. So thank you, Commissioner Simmons, for starting us down this rabbit hole. This is not a rabbit hole that you did, but I'm going to go down the rabbit hole now. As I look, or as we calculate the total budget for each school, and this isn't a specific page, it really applies to all of the pages for all of our schools. I do notice that some of our schools have a higher percentage of students with higher levels of need. Our L students, our English language learners, our students with disabilities. And at many of these schools, we have a certain number of assistant principals, and I'm wondering, when we're calculating the total budget for each of these schools, are we taking into consideration equitable student funding based on levels of need? And I know that's kind of a throwback to the Brizard era before my time, but I know that was a term that was commonly used, equitable student funding, where they used to assign different dollar amounts for the different levels of need for students. And I'm wondering, as we address equity as a district, it's one of our main board goals, are we looking at that when we staff our administration in schools, and then just staff our schools in general to make sure all of our students are adequately being served?
So I'm going to start here. I think there's some sense of bounded autonomy with schools that we need to get to. When we did go to equities, I think going back a little bit, and this prior to my historical knowledge, there was some decisions to cut potentially a librarian, or cut a custodian, or cut an arts teacher, right? You know, so there wasn't a bounded sense of autonomy on it. And I think what we have to do is establish some parameters around how you could spend money. And we went on this side of it where we do that by ratio, right, in contracts, and we distribute staff. We do want to get to a point where building principals have some decision-making and have some ability to make some funding decisions around it. We do that very much so with grants, right? A lot of our schools have heavy grants. We were at a school today that has approximately almost $1.5 million in grants, where they can make some decisions on that money and how they want to use it. And some of those formulas are very much driven by your population, right? Your title money is going to be driven by your population. How we allocated art money was driven based on receiver status of school, L special ed as well. So money has been allocated in that sense. We're not at a central space yet where we could provide that bounded autonomy beyond what we're doing right now with grants. But there is some autonomy schools have with grants, and a lot of them say, I may hire an additional administrator, right? I'm going to hire a project implementation specialist, I'm going to hire a community site coordinator, I'm going to get an extra administrator here, I'm going to use it for intervention. So there are some decision makings with those grant funds and autonomy that schools have. From a central budget, we are not there yet.
So that's something we're continuing to work towards.
Yes, we'll continue to have some of those conversations about what is and what we're prepared to move forward with on autonomy on spending.
Okay, yeah, because I'm looking just at enrollment numbers, and schools with similar enrollment numbers, with similar budgets, but with different numbers of administrators. And then when you look at the percentage of maybe students with disabilities within given schools, the amount of time needed to properly service those kids, we want to make sure that they're getting.
Absolutely, I think that's what's the difficulty once we start to get into the nuances of the numbers. I may elect as a building principal to say, instead of hiring another administrator or another teacher, intervention teacher, I'm gonna bring a vendor in. Right, and that may you see in contract, so the positions may not be there, right? It may not be equal positions, but
But
some
other
level of
supports.
supports may be there as
Okay.
well. So you're not seeing it as straight as numbers, and that's the real difficult part when we start to get into the nuances of real numbers here, is really looking at the whole picture of how the school is making some decisions around what the supports are.
Okay, thank you.
President Elliott?
No questions?
Okay, and I just want to point out too, regarding like SOTA and EOLs, I do think that there is a way to create a different admissions process that still allows for students to perhaps audition in their native language and showcase their talents that way, and then provide those EOL supports. And same with special education, right? Modifying it so that students have equal opportunity to still audition. So I don't want to advocate to remove the audition process. I want to advocate that we modify and accommodate our students and meet them where they're at, whether it's a language barrier or, a processing, for the process. But I do want to point out that a number of students from some of our schools that historically serve ELL, like School 15, a large percentage of the students there who were classified ELL in elementary then are declassified as ELL because now their English is strong and so they no longer need those supports and services, do end up also auditioning and getting into SOTA. So I think because of the way that the process is set up, it doesn't reflect the diversity of students that are there at SOTA because of that, but also, you don't stay ELL forever. And that's, the goal is that you're not labeled ELL forever. So I just want to point that out and advocate that as we have these conversations around, changes, that we still give them the autonomy because it is a specialized performing arts school, but that they then give us the flexibility to serve all of our families, not just the ones who are naturally strong in English speaking because they were naturally, born and raised here.
Yeah, bingo, right? School of the Arts program being achieved is an intense program, right? You're going to have to love the arts to do it, and if you don't love the arts, you're not going to be as successful, right? Because you have to take an arts pathway, you have to get involved in the arts. So, absolutely. But what we have to do is elevate, like you just said, the multilingual and the students with disabilities to get them into a place where they could get through an audition and be considered and accepted into the program. But absolutely, you have to have that passion and love for the arts, because if you don't, it'll be a more difficult graduation path for a student that doesn't want to do that.
Thank you. And then second round, I'm going to go back to our students. Rep David.
I didn't know I can ask more than one question at a time, so, but I will say that I love the word autonomy and equity, and I keep going back to my school, early college, because I think it's a prime example of lack of equity and autonomy. Recently, I just recently turned 17, right? Usually that's like the time where like you get like driver's license, blah, blah, blah. Driver's ed is very expensive. Like it's very expensive. And however, I saw that, East and Edison, they're doing driver's ed in their school, or it's East that does driver's ed in their school, yeah. And I heard that any student in RCC can participate, so I called. They said that they don't know anything about it, so I called the CTE director, Mr. Cox. He said, hey David, so in the summertime, driver's ed is actually going to be open for every RCC high school, and in the September, it's actually being offered as a class to every RCC high school, except early college. So that was a huge bummer. So it's like, okay, so the kids in my school can't take driver's ed. He said, but we will support you guys in early college to take driver's ed at Wilson. However, I feel like that's a very technical, burden. And another thing is like, I'm looking at enrollment, and I can't help but compare enrollment from school without walls to early college. School Without Walls is their own building, right? Early college is on one floor. It's a hallway. Like, it's a hallway. So I can't help but be frustrated, especially because when we talk about, you know, making our school district footprint smaller and like changing around school configuration and things like that. Early college has the highest graduation rate in the district. It has a 98, right? Our model is pretty successful, but we're on the like top of a middle school and elementary school building, and a lot of people don't know that. Like, we're literally on the top floor of, you know, another school, and it's not our school. It's not like Wilson High School and Wilson Foundation. It's a whole different program, a whole different model, and it causes a lot of conflicts. We can't have, for example, Miss Mehta, our principal, she worked tooth and nail to get us 2 lunch periods, because originally when you had 1 lunch period for the whole school, but now we have 1 for freshmen and then 1 for another students. So that way kids are going to MCC, they could eat lunch earlier and be with their friends, not have, you know, freshmen and stuff. But things like that, like things that are very basic, we can't necessarily have. And I know that World of Inquiry kind of has the same issues, because they're high schoolers and they won't have their own space, and it's kind of difficult when you have middle schoolers and elementary schoolers running around. And, you know, obviously, and I'm not saying that middle school and elementary students are bad, but there's a certain like need and space that high schoolers need, and that I feel like some students are not getting that. So yeah, I just want to know like what lays in the future for schools like early college or students at World of Inquiry, or, you know, other schools that are specialized and need a place to grow out. So thank you.
I love the question. You know, wow. So, yes, as you know, we're going into a reconfiguration, right, for 24-25, and one of my commitments is to not have mixed grade levels anymore, right? Not to have a K-6 with a 9-12 or a 7-8 to 9-12, right? And that's going to take some conversations and some work as a board and as a community to get there. But I recognize Rochester Early College. I recognize, you know, I remember the conversation I had as school chief when we said we needed to get to the 2 lunches there, and how are we going to make that happen with the other schools. So I remember that discussion. I also remember the intent and how it was meant to be, where a portion of the school went to MCC campus, right? And that went by several, probably 5-6 years ago now, I'm guessing, right? You know, where it ended up being all the students on that one floor, which is cramped. So we hear it, I hear it. It will be, you know, there will not be a K-8 or a K-6 and a 9-12 in my recommendations as I work forward with the board.
Piece too, that a number of board commissioners also agree that early college needs its own building and space, and it's something that we're committed to ensuring, because you're right, the work that your principal does there should not go unrecognized, and it doesn't go unnoticed. And I just want to put that on record. Many of us support early college and the work that you guys do, but we also recognize that y'all deserve a building, a field to play sports, and also I will do some follow-up on why you're not having the opportunity to have driver's ed. At every high school it's going to be offered, except early college is unacceptable. I just wanted to put that on record. Sorry about that. Diva?
I have 2 general questions.
Está bien.
As new students enter the district, how is the district ensuring available ELL seats for programming? Continue or?
No, sí, dale, go.
Okay. And the other question is, are all mandate service, I'm sorry, have patience with my English.
You're great.
I'm in progress. Mandated services for ELLs and students with disabilities fully funded for both internal and external students. How will the public know this?
So I will start with placement, right? We project our enrollment, and we have programs across the district where we do have a set of contingency seats that we use for adding staff when we are in need of them, right? We have some actually in both the English language learning department, world bilingual and world language department. We also have some as and placement office, right, to make adjustments if we have an increased enrollment, if we are off in our projections, if something happens, like a hurricane we experience, right? You know, we are prepared to add staff and have that in the budget to do that. In terms of special education support for bilingual education, I'll have Des respond to that.
Yeah, we also include contingencies in case it grows, and we monitor that every year and, you know, monthly, because we know as they come in, we work with the school chiefs to determine if they need more staffing, and then we decide how we're going to pay for it through contingencies that we have, that we create with the budget department.
Do you want me to say the second question again? Are all mandated services for ELL and students with disability fully funded for both internal and external students? And how does the public know this?
So, as I was saying before, we take a look at existing students that we have, and then we project out on what we need. And yes, and we are fully funded according to the way I've worked with my team and worked with the school chiefs. We're fully funded at this point. So, and I think the public would know, I think at that second part of your question is, we do present this at our Special Education Parent Association meeting, but if it has to be more publicly through the budget process, like, is it a document, you think, just to, you know, and we do definitely go to CPAC and present and tell them what, because they do ask us.
So
Is the budget?
Yep, I'm going to have Deputy Superintendent Strickland, sorry. The other thing is when you enter placement, you're going to be provided with information about where programs are, what type of programs they are. There is information on our websites in terms of what's a bilingual program, what's a transitional program, what offerings are where. But I will also have Deputy Superintendent add some things.
Thank you, Parent Rep Garcia. So first and foremost, we are actually expanding our bilingual programming at the Franklin campus. One of the things that have been cited in our bilingual cap is the limited amount of seats that we don't have for our bilingual learners. So we have started by adding those individuals in those core classes at that school. In particular, when it comes to internal and external services for our bilingual and ESL students, we are pretty much covered internally. Our external services are going to have to make sure we monitor and look at them, and also look at our internal efficiencies to make sure that everyone has a proper caseload, and they are serving the correct ratio of students. And when Beds Day comes, we will have to make sure we start doing true-ups. And what that means is we are going to make sure everyone has a proper caseload, and then we can make sure that we are covered with students in our BOCES programs, covered in different organizations that don't necessarily service the students in district but out of district. And last but not least, we're also creating a plan to improve the world languages. So we currently only offer Spanish, and I know that Annalie and her team is working diligently in making sure that we have an array of languages to provide our students.
¿Ya? ¿Ya terminaste? Okay, thank you, Devasthan. Y palabra. Yeah, this is round two. We have one more round. Commissioner Powell?
Thank you. So there's a lot of ways to go through the schools portion, and one methodology is just to look at how they compare year over year. Are they, and you kind of get a sense that, okay, well, it's basically the same funding plus inflation, but there are a couple of instances that are standouts. James Monroe, both lower and upper, have a significantly larger budget this year than last year. And I found that, and that's even in the face of some like decreases, like a decrease in guidance representing almost 14%, and a decrease in ELL of almost 19% in the upper. So just to help me get a context around that, is it because we're not pushing so many ELL students into Monroe that we're going to try to equitably distribute them throughout the district high schools? And what else could explain why some of the schools are getting like a little boost? There hasn't been any discussion about a focused effort to spend more money on one school over another. And so I'm wondering what the rationale is for a 15% increase at Monroe Lower and a 9% increase at Monroe Upper. Most of our high schools have a larger percentage increase than our elementary schools anyway. I think it's just, you know, just a function of where the costs are, but is there anyone who could explain?
So I'm gonna
in other words, what's different? What's going to be different at Monroe next year compared to this year?
Thank you for that question, Commissioner Powell. So we just engaged in some sort of the equity conversation. There has been an increase in the number of special education students that Monroe Upper and Lower are serving, and that leads to a decrease in the amount of general education students that are being served. The allocations for special education students are in fact higher. So I wanted to kind of chime in earlier, Commissioner Malloy. What we are already doing is bringing multiple departments, i.e. the English Language Learner Department, or excuse me, BEWL. We're bringing program efficiencies, placement, special education to the table in July to actually build programs around students with disabilities and bilingual learners and English language learners to really focus the continuums so that we are not in a space where we plan on adding those programs of our neediest learners after the fact. So we have to really make sure that we try to start somewhere with equitable resources and then build general education continuums on top of that, or excuse me, that's not really continuum, but build on top of those continuums being in place. So that's how you get to equity. Place in SPED, place in L first, then we place Gen Ed. And that would lead to those increases that you're seeing in the amount of special education students at those schools in particular.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Thank you, Commissioner Powell. Commissioner Simmons?
Thank you. Okay, I want to just challenge my understanding or I guess around enrollment. So tell me if I'm thinking about this right and correct me, because I'm probably not. But if there's a school that has the capacity to accommodate more than one strand in a grade level, let's say kindergarten, what have you, and they have the capacity, building capacity to accommodate that, but they only have the one strand, and it's not being expanded to maybe 2 or 3 strands, so the community is looking to get into that school, but they don't have more than one strand, that could appear as if enrollment is stagnant or declining. Is that correct?
Yeah, yes, I think, which is underlying another issue, right? You know, so if you have seats available in the zone, right, or an area, you're going to want to fill those up before you add another section, right? You know, and so that's where this becomes the dialogue of what is our capacity based on our enrollment? And do we have too much capacity based on our enrollment? Because if I have two sections that still have 15 seats available in each of those schools, and there's 30 seats sitting there, and this school wants to now go to overage to add a section, now I've just added another class and I still have these sitting here, right? You know, so it becomes a seat availability and space
Okay.
that then dictates a little bit in terms of what you have in enrollment. And that's the difficult thing we have right now with our current footprint and capacity based on what we're able to serve.
And that can then impact maybe the goal of neighborhood schools and things of that nature as well, so it comes
And filling
to a
schools,
place
right?
like this.
And filling schools to their capacity if you're able to start to do that. And then you have resources. There's a lot of things that lead from there.
Yeah.
But that's part of when you do projected enrollment and you start to lay out sections, that becomes a little bit of, if there's a school that has the ability for someone to want to go into it to add a section, but there's seats elsewhere, you know,
Okay.
how do you maximize your resources?
Thank you. And then CFO Farr, thank you so much for the categories that you've outlined here. On this sheet where it says school profile function categories, transportation is listed as for student field trips, parent transportation and meetings, so on and so forth. And I'm looking at the different school transportation budget lines and, you know, seeing that there are dollars allocated there. And I guess I'm trying to find out how we support transportation on a greater scale. So I'll use Edison as an example. When we talk about secondary schools, most of them are on a bus line, is my understanding, where students are able to just pull, you know, get right to the school, some in partnership. Edison lost a major bus access to their school during COVID, I think. And so I think the bus line that was closest to the school at that time, or the pulled in front of the school, excuse me. Now there's one that's maybe 37 minutes away, I'm understanding. How are we addressing those type of issues when it comes to transportation and those dollars?
So this transportation here in this line
Yeah.
is school decision transportation, right? I'm gonna put it in this line for field trips.
Field trips, right.
Most schools will do that after the fact. They'll adjust it, right? Say, now I want to move this to transportation. For transportation, they move those funds around. Others of it sometimes are for passes, right? You know, for if high school students, parents, all that. Transportation line transportations are handled centrally. I understand the decision with where it is, but I'll have Chief Operating Officer Schmidt talk about that.
Good evening, everyone. Commissioner, you're absolutely right. The change of the bus line has been a very large challenge for that campus in 3 areas. One, to get students to and from job sites for their CTE programming. The second being interscholastic athletics, because quite often the teams are combined, so Edison students are either combining with another school and getting either students to Edison or Edison students to another location has been a challenge for us. And then I think the third area is that it does limit opportunities for other students to take a CTE course at Edison. So with the shuttle bus challenge for them by not being on the bus line is something that I think we're struggling with in many areas. There's a very tight window where we can actually provide that shuttle service without impacting our to and from school. It's not a shortage of buses by any means. It's really impacted by the driver shortage. So we've been able to mitigate that a little bit. We've in the short term. Coordinator Cox has been working with our team to strategize some ways around creative, either sharing transportation areas or transportation models or looking at the scheduling of programming. It's not by any means a solution to the problem. In terms of the athletics, we ran into some bumps, especially early in the fall, but we were able to strategize and come up with some ways to meet all the different teams' needs. But the combination of teams and the addition of teams, that challenge is not going to go away. And I think the third area in planning for next year is being able to bring some more vehicles online. So we're looking at some other options besides just a traditional bus for that transportation purpose. Getting more people certified to be able to drive those small groups of students, 1 or 2 students to a job site, or a small number of students to and from for example, as I make eye contact with Commissioner Malloy, there may be only a couple of swimmers that may be going to Freddie Thomas for swim practice, but yet we may need a larger vehicle to transport a larger team like a soccer team. So by able to kind of coordinate those different types of groups. So we're actually aligning those 3 areas in our plan for transportation, but Edison is the one that's most exposed by that, ironically. It's really not the other ones because they all are on bus lines. And we really are advocating with RTS to put that stop closer to the Edison campus. Right now, you're right, it's at Mount Reed and Lyle Avenue. That's the closest stop for us, which is it's not safe and it's not convenient. So we really need to make sure that we advocate for that. And they've been willing to look at it, but it is a financial decision on their part as well. So to and from school is not a challenge, but all those other outlier runs certainly are. So
We got to figure that out, and I appreciate you helping me understand this is more of a centralized issue than obviously a school profile piece. And I can also imagine that not only would it impact the ability to get the athletics and things like that, but it directly would correlate with academics. If a child misses a bus or is late, they're missing seat time in school in that first class, and we can go further and further, and as Commissioner Malloy said, down the rabbit hole of this conversation. So I will stop there, but I appreciate that clarity. And then lastly, I just want to make a statement regarding Rochester Early College, because I know that we continue to have these conversations. I'm new to the board. Last year, we talked about Rochester Early College, and we want to see them in their own building, and it's the mantra that we speak. But I think that it would be best served if we show action behind it, if it's something that we're truly interested in. So I hope to engage in the near future some real tangible dialogue about what that really looks like, and if there's a timeline where people don't hear, we want to see it happen, but when will it happen? That would be awesome. But thank you.
You want to respond about the
Yes,
retreat?
I do. About the retreat.
Yeah, go ahead,
So,
do the retreat conversation.
So we are slated for reconfiguration 24-25, right? And we're going to talk about what that approach is going to be. During conversations I had with the president and the vice president, we talked about when I could have conversations with the board, and the board, we could work from a retreat lens of what this really looks like. We need to have some conversations about what projected enrollment looks like, what does our landscape look like, how many schools it impacts, and what type of, what is everyone going to be comfortable with, and what are we going to be able to move forward with, and we need to be all on the same page on that. So I proposed some potential dates in May, June, July for us to come together to begin to have these conversations.
On a Saturday, I just want to put it out there now so we can all be mentally prepared.
We'll
But
do
it's
some
a good,
breakfast. I'll flip some
no, it's a
pancakes.
good
I'll do
use of our
something.
Saturday. Just want to put that out there. Commissioner Beloy?
Thank you. Thanks for answering that, actually, because that was one of my other questions, so now I don't need to ask that, so kudos, thank you. And also, Commissioner Simmons, we are right on the same wavelength. Come on now. Come on. Thank you. So I want to talk a little bit about something I've noticed about the budget book in general. When we look at all of our schools, I would really love to see moving forward capacity numbers listed for each of our schools. So we have like the total enrollment and then maybe the projected enrollment for 23, 24, ideally, which you can't really calculate yet. But yeah, what's the capacity of each school? So that's always part of our mindset as we're moving forward, looking at the budget. Are we operating at capacity or how far below capacity? And these are things we have to consider moving forward. But that's actually not my real question. I was looking at building subs building subs I've noticed are in some of our buildings. We have budgeted for some of those. And I'm wondering, many buildings appear to be staffed with at least one building substitute. And what criteria do we use to determine which buildings are budgeted for the building sub? I think that there's a lot of value in having a building substitute, especially as we move forward. We have to think about the impact we have budget-wise, whether or not the decisions we make are going to result in a direct impact on student outcomes. And I think building those relationships with teachers and adults that they trust and know is important, not only in the cafeteria with our SSOs, but also with building substitutes. And I think that students are more likely to get work done when there's a need for a substitute, rather than just calling someone from our sub-pool. Having that building level substitute, I think, is really valuable. And that doesn't cover all the needs, but there's that trusted adult who can add to that. So why are some buildings not staffed with a budget or a building sub?
So I want to answer your comment, although it doesn't need an answer, but I'm going to answer the comment, and then we'll hit the building sub. So we can put capacity on the buildings, but I also want to caution us we may not want to operate schools at capacity.
Well,
Right, so what I don't
That's
want
not
is like
ideal.
for someone to see a 2,000 student high school, do we want 2,000 students in our high school,
No.
right? And so we have some instructional decisions in terms of what we believe is optimal for high school figures to be at, and what we think is optimal for potentially 7th, 8th grade, and what's optimal at the elementary grades. And I think that's going to be part of our conversation as well. So we could absolutely include building capacity, but I just don't want people to think that fill it to your capacity, because
Right.
that
Yeah,
could
we
be a
don't want to
little
do
worry.
that, but I will say that if you have 1,000 students in a building with a capacity of 2,500,
Yeah, you have some room.
as we
Yep.
do at some of our high schools, I think that when we have some high schools like Edison that are just burgeoning at the seams,
Yep.
there's some inequity there.
Yep, absolutely. So to the building subs, everyone has a building sub. Contractually, we have 25 building subs that we have to maintain every year, and that's always been the practice, is that prior to COVID and we would budget for 25 building subs, and the school chiefs, as a prior school chief, we would start to look at data and see where the highest use were to appropriate those 25. So if you look at the sheet that Sean provided, where it says movement of positions, those 25, along with a bunch of other building subs, all went into ARP several years ago. So we've just moved 12 of those back, right? So 12 of those are going to show in general fund in the top section of this of FTEs. When we get into ARP and you look in the ARP section, you'll see where all the other building subs, they're all in ARP. Everyone has a building sub, but they're showing in here because they're general funded FTEs that are coming back to the general fund budget. Next year, we're going to have to bring the other 13 back to the general fund budget. So having those off, plus every school has one,
Right.
right? So if that's an ambition, right, that's an additional, you're talking an additional 25 positions that you have to look at to say, if everyone wants to get a building sub, what else falls off because of that, right? So those, right now, 25 is what RTA has in the contract that we staff to when we do the budget process.
So every school has a building sub?
Every school has a
Okay.
building sub.
The page I was looking on, I think, was page 36 of the budget book, and I saw that some schools didn't appear to have one, so it was a little confusing for me. And to be perfectly honest, I know it's unfair maybe to compare our school district to the suburbs, but I look at my own high school where I teach, and we have 3 building subs for my high school alone. And the ability to seamlessly provide instruction for our students, I think is very valuable. And not seeing that same thing in other districts is saddening to me.
Commissioner Powell, I know you've been trying to flag to add some comment.
Yeah, I did have something to add to the conversation about capacity. Is it accurate to say that the schools that are not providing strands that would fill every classroom in the building are also under-chosen schools? That there's a reason that there aren't 3 strands in a building that could hold 3 strands because they're not being chosen by the families?
So, it's a very, I guess a double-edged sword is how I'll say it, right? Yes, some of it is school selection, right? Some of it is then they're filled with special classes, right, with students with disabilities, and then they run out of space that way. So I don't want to say that it's all under selected schools, right? But I would say.
That's what happened to School 6
Yep.
before.
But there are
in
some
years.
schools that are strands projected based on what has been enrolled and projected enrolled for previous years. What has been, the school selection choice, right? What is coming in as kindergarten registration. So there are some schools that obviously have lower selection status than other schools, right? And we're trying to up, for us, we've put a real conscious effort into making sure that everyone chooses a school, right? Because then we're using real data about school choice versus making some assumptions in terms of why a school may not be selected or not selected. So we have to, you know, and Marisol and her team did a really good job this year of really campaigning that. We saw the billboards, we saw the buses, we saw the commercials, right? We saw all of that to get those numbers up for managed school choice, for school choice. That's got to be the driver of this for us to make the best informed decisions.
Yeah, I just wanted that to come out in the course of the conversation. Thank you.
Okay, I'm going to actually move over to President Elliott, but I will circle back to you to add a comment as well. President Elliott, you said you had a question.
This is in reference to the early childhood program. I was at one of our CBOs and understood that there are a number of those students that are being pulled from the CBOs, and that's concerning for me because it is the CBOs that have the greatest impact on our students, even with our schools, in terms of relationships that they have with the parents, in terms of just being in the community, and to know that. And then there were one CBO who was not even contacted, but just the decision was made to pull, I think probably 100, if I'm not mistaken. And so, you know, if we're talking about trying to have a structured budget, it seems to me that that decision was not in the best interest of our budget, because it's far more cost efficient to have our students in the CBOs. And in this particular CBO, I understand that the data demonstrates that they're doing an exciting job. And so I want to put that on the record, as Vice President can say for the record, that, you know, we've got these CBOs that are far more cost efficient, but with the kinds of salaries and benefits that, you know, we're going to be spending money on when they could do it better. And I'm not saying all the CBOs, some of those CBOs we may need to pull our students back in, but, you know, we've got some programs that are running very well, and to pull them back, that's a criticism. I'll just have to say that.
So I'm going to start, and then I'm going to have Executive Director Hooper come up to add some things. There's been no conscious effort. I lived it several years ago when there was a pullback of CBO seats to district office. I went to central positions. I sat through those board meetings. I sat to listen to all the speakers. There's been no budgetary going out and saying we're pulling CBO seats back. But I'm going to have Executive Director Hooper talk a little bit about how the seats were allocated this year.
Well, good evening, President Elliott and Commissioners. There is an awful lot of information I could share about this because it's taken probably hundreds of hours. I don't know if some of you recall at the beginning of the school year in September, we had a large number of classrooms from CBOs that I was informed about a week before school began they would not be able to open the classrooms because they didn't have teachers. I believe what might have happened to them, I don't know, but districts were scrambling to get teachers those last 2 weeks in August. They were offering all kinds of signing bonuses and everything. So I think some of the teachers were hired from the CBOs at the last minute, and that was why they didn't have teachers for the classrooms. It was a large number of classrooms that came back to us. There were some that came that week before school started, but there were others that we were told about in June that they weren't going to be able to keep the same number of classrooms. And they informed us, and that was helpful because when I knew in June, we could plan for it. And we could put those, ask other CBOs, schools, find space for those classrooms. When I found out about it a week before school started, that was a very difficult situation because at that time, those students all expected to go to school on the first day of school, and the classrooms they were projected to had no teachers, so I couldn't send them there. So our department worked over Labor Day weekend contacting parents and contacting schools and CBOs to move all of those kids, and it took us about 2 to 3 weeks. So during that time at the beginning of the school year, every family who came in and registered had to wait about 3 weeks to get a placement because we had to place all the children from the CBOs that thought they were going to be able to start on day one before we went to the new registrants that came through the door. And we always get a lot of new registrants in September. So, I mean, what we did when we did the RFP this year, one part of that we have to consider, like there are different sections and they each have a certain number of points, but one section talks about quality and about, ability to retain staff. And that's where some of our CBOs were, really suffering.
So in this particular example that I'm not giving a name right now, I could talk to you offline about it. They were never contacted by your department. The parents knew before the CBO knew. And so that's a disconnect too, because they were calling the CBO to say, well, I was told that, I can't have my child or children in this program. And so they were not contacted. And this is one of the ones, I believe they serve the most students from UPK, and they were not notified. And they've got a lot of data that indicates that they're doing a good job with those students. And so I don't know if this is something that your department is doing across the board by bringing the students back in because of what you're saying is that they don't have any teachers. I don't think this is the case with this one CBO.
Okay.
And so I think that we'll have to talk about that.
Yeah,
and they are ready.
Because our two biggest ones both gave classes back.
Yeah. In this case, well, maybe it's not the biggest one, but in this case, I'm told that they were not informed, and they have the capacity and they do have the staff to be able to do it. But we could talk about that offline.
Yeah.
And as it relates to because my issue is that if we're taking students back, albeit understanding that they may not have teachers, but this is an efficient program, and so those ones that can do it, we need to be allowing them to do it. Now, if they can't do it, that's a whole different ballgame. But in terms of cost efficiencies, the CBOs have been, able to help us to keep our costs down.
Now, that has kind of changed, President Elliott, because last year, because of this teacher shortage, I already saw it was going to be a big problem for our CBOs. So I applied for a waiver with the state to allow the CBOs to hire teachers with the same credentials that they have to have for childcare, which would be a CDA, a Child Development Associate credential. They are able to hire people with that credential at lower rates than certified teachers. And the other thing that I did, which is going to be very difficult, but I knew I had to do it, was I increased the per child rate by $1,000 per child in the RFP to $10,000 per child. And then we gave them also additional funding, raised it to $10,000 per child for this year, going back till September. So I saw the problem was severe enough that if I didn't do something drastic, they were not going to be able to continue to keep their classrooms open.
All right. So I'll follow back up again, and because they can do the work, is what I'm told. Yes. I am going to visit one tomorrow. Tomorrow's Thursday. One of the CBOs for our UPK program, And, but, you know, if they can do it, because there's so many more benefits than just the cost of having them
Yes.
in those community-based
Yes,
organizations. And
but
so-
our costs are getting similar because
Okay.
now most of our more experienced pre-K teachers in the district have retired. There are very few of them left, so we have much newer teachers.
Okay.
Actually, we have newer teachers across the board. That is one of our big challenges, training and providing enough professional development for all the teachers.
Okay, well, thank you. Appreciate the response. Thank you, Vice President.
Yes, thank you. I'm going to just piggyback to Commissioner Malloy, who had some follow-up. Yep.
And it's actually related, so Dr. Hooper might need you in a moment, or perhaps Dr. Paluzzo. It's regarding pre-K in our individual buildings, and I know this is kind of a separate entity when we talk. It's very similar to what Commissioner Elliott was just saying, and just strands in schools, elementary schools. Some of our families are frustrated when they're in a 3 or 4-year-old pre-K program and then really want to go to that kindergarten in the same school. And I know my own children are past kindergarten age now, so this doesn't affect me, but many of the people I know are directly impacted by this. And they're frustrated because some of our elementary schools maybe have, 5 strands of a 4-year-old classroom and then only 2 strands of kindergarten to go into. And those families really want that same building. How do we address that when we look at our budget to ensure that we're providing continuity for our students and our families?
So this is addressed partially in the managed choice policy as well, right? We're talking about this in the managed choice policy. And so some of the difficulties are if we're not sectioned right, and if we don't have strands right, then that makes it difficult. So case in point, we have elementary schools that have gone through FMP, that have space and they have multiple pre-K classrooms, right? And then to transition to K makes that difficult in terms of choice. What this comes back to is, once again, once we reconfigure to have those section strands so that there's 2 strands in pre-K that are 3, 2 pre-Ks that are 4, then they go to kindergarten, right? That's what we need to start to do for our section. But right now, because how it is, when you get a building that may not be fully utilized and has space in rooms, and we're looking for classrooms, especially sometimes at last minute, the question is who has space, what building has space, and that's where the pre-K classes end up. And we don't want to do that in the end of the year, because what ends up happening is that class needs a bathroom, so then you move in another class out of the class, and it becomes this trickle effect for when we do it late. But ultimately, we need to have pre-K sections that feed up to K, and they have to be proportionate to what is coming. And if it's not, then we're going to get what we have right now, where we have multiple pre-K sections in certain buildings, and then those kids don't end up in that same school.
All right, thank you. Sorry, so I just wanted to just put some stuff on the record in terms of asking for the capacity in the book. I've asked all commissioners to also participate in the participatory budgeting to give feedback on what the book should look like. And I just want to drive that this book has always been developed based on what elected officials, whether it was city council or school board members, want to see, but in reality, it's our families and our communities that need to be able to digest and understand what's here. So if it makes the cut, it makes the cut, but I will be prototyping and doing some focus groups with different families on samples once we get there. So I just want to put that out there as well. The other piece, I just wanted to uplift the pre-K issue. I've brought this up many times before. Yes, families are frustrated, but it is an internal policy through managed choice that conflicts with New York State law that says parents cannot be restricted to where their kids go for pre-K. So that funding comes with that understanding that the pre-K options are wherever, whether it's a school or a CBO. Parents' choice is number one, and it has to be driven that way. I know that we do some encouragement to keep families in the zone, and that we've started to do some of the education, like, okay, yeah, you want your kid to go to this school, but it's outside of your zone. And the zone is a policy, so we have a law that conflicts with a policy internally, and until we address that issue, we're going to continue to have parents who select based on like, oh, my cousin went there and it's a great program, and then come kindergarten, you don't live nowhere near the school and there's not going to be transportation available, because that's what it really comes down to. And there's a cost to the transportation piece that drives these things. So I just want to, again, just put that on record. I also want to uplift the CBO staffing issue, because even us last year, we were trying to apply for a CBO for my grandson, and there was no staffing, and then they said there's a waiting list. We were on the waiting list for a few months, and then finally we heard back that it just wasn't going to be an option, which then led us to have to reapply internally through the managed choice, all late. And so we did get a school close to about half a mile from my daughter's home. But I will tell you all that this last week, when we were doing the presser for the Imagination Library, I drove around the corner and I didn't realize that School 19 is actually 0.2 miles from my daughter's home versus 0.5 miles. And so right now I take my grandson to school, but in my mind I was like, why? First of all, I'm geographically challenged. I always say this all the time over and over, but why wouldn't something like that be flagged, right? Like, here's an address. School 19 wasn't even an option for her because she tried to select schools that she thought, based on her knowledge, versus that being somewhat automatic populated to say, here's your address and these are actually the schools closest to you. So I just wanted to point that out, because I left and I drove around the corner. I'm like, we could be right around the corner and I don't even have to factor this into my own schedule of picking up and dropping off this kid every day. So having had that conversation, but I just wanted to point that out. And lastly, I do want to point out that we do pay RTS a whole boatload of money, and if they cannot accommodate a bus schedule, that we may have to start looking outside. I know that right now they have a monopoly on the transit system, and I get that. But the way that the economy is going, there's a lot of competitive opportunities for transportation that may not be local. We may have to do a statewide or interstate or multiple state RFP process to figure out this transportation issue. So I just have to put that out there. But I would like to go back to the table, because this was an issue a few years back with them changing the stop locations for Monroe until a kid almost got hit. And that's what we want to avoid, because Mount Hope, Mount Reed is nowhere near safe for any child to have to walk across or even be near when they can have a stop located right on their campus or close to. Because I understand their struggle and their challenge with balancing our needs versus those of the community and where they're going to pick up riders, but there are plenty of neighborhoods and areas that are much closer to where they're dropping them off that gets the kid right near that campus and puts our staff, quite frankly, too, in the position to be there to greet those kids to ensure that they're coming into the class and school. With that, Divet, ¿tiene pregunta todavía? I'm going to start with Divet, and then I'll go to David, and we'll go down the line. This is the final round. Thank you.
This is a general question. Our CSD is adding several bilingual pre-K classrooms. How will those children be supported with all these changes?
Now, Commissioner Powell may remember when we developed that work group and started the bilingual pre-Ks, I think it was 2005, but I don't know if I'm trusting my memory to when that happened. So we were always a forerunner in having bilingual pre-K programs. We started them back in, I think, around 2005 with the bilingual director then, who was Diana Hernandez. And the work group was formed by Willa, and I was a big part of it. I was running the Florence Brown pre-K program at School 33 then, and I had supervised that bilingual program, the pre-K, but also the school-age program for a while when I was an assistant principal there. So I had knowledge about bilingual programs, even though I'm not bilingual myself. And you know, I thought it was really important for the children to have an opportunity to become strong in their first language so they could better learn English. And I convinced our New York State representatives that this was true and pulled out the research. We did a lot of research. And so they, you know, agreed it would be okay because New York State Ed for pre-K, there are no requirements to have any kind of bilingual education or English as a new language or any kind of bilingual services at all. They don't start until kindergarten. So what we have done, when we started out, we had 3 bilingual pre-Ks, one at 9, one at 17, and one at 33. 33 was dual language because that's the program they had in the building, and then the other 2 were transitional. Now, you know, over the years, it's been quite a few years, the demand has increased, and a change occurred during that time. A lot of this has evolved over time. When we began, we used to have children go through a language assessment to see what their dominance was. And the only way they got into the Spanish-speaking side, a transitional program, or the Spanish side of a dual language program, was if they passed and showed they were Spanish dominant. Now we accept heritage speakers along with children who are Spanish dominant. So that's a big change. So children who have somebody in their home that speaks Spanish and they're around Spanish, it might be a parent, it might be a grandparent, they are eligible too to go into a bilingual pre-K program. The other difference about bilingual pre-K from other bilingual programs is that the state does not require you to have a bilingual pre-K teacher. We currently do have bilingual pre-K teachers in all our 4-year-old bilingual pre-K programs. It is a best practice, but the state will allow you to have a monolingual teacher with a bilingual para. And that's what we did this year, past year, when we opened up the experimental 3-year-old bilingual pre-K program. That is new. So these 2 things have increased our demand, including the heritage speakers, and segueing into bilingual 3-year-old programs, which is a brand new thing for us. We tried one this year at School 22, and we're looking to try a few more next year. So that's where the other increase comes. But we have a lot more flexibility than school age does in serving bilingual students. I don't know if you have any other questions.
Yeah. Okay, gracias, David?
So, I had a quick question on, well, not a question, but actually, yeah, I have a question as well. But I have a suggestion on maybe like when you guys draft, you know, next year's budget, or if there can be like a section where it's like a kind of like a comment box where it says like, this is why this looks different from last year. Just because like there's all, for example, I know we have this packet and it explains a lot, but I feel like for the general public, it'll be really nice to know why things are different or why things are added, and why, for example, some schools have, you know, certain, like, it says psychological services, right? That's only offered at East, so it's like, oh, well, this is like blah, 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 blah. You know, things like that. I think that'll be really helpful for the general public. Another thing, I haven't seen Virtual Academy of Rochester in the school profile. I don't know if it's there or not. I really love the Virtual Academy of Rochester. I feel like we should keep supporting them. They're great. They're great at building bridges, especially for kids who don't have AP classes at their school or dual enrollment. My Chinese teacher at my school, she does a Virtual Academy, so any kid who wants to take Chinese in district, they can just sign up for Chinese on Virtual Academy. So I think that's really cool, and I don't see it on the school profile, but it'll be really nice for them to also get the support that they need. Thank you.
Thanks, David. Dr. Peluso, do you want to comment on where virtual school would be?
It's in the it's under IM&T in the administration section of the budget.
Yeah, so just for clarity, it's not a school, but it is funded.
It's there. Yeah. We have
Okay, thank you. Commissioner Patterson, did you have any questions? Thank you. And we noted that you were a judge tonight for our kids doing the storytelling, so thank you. Commissioner Powell?
Thank you. Montessori, page 68. This program, at the risk of going into even more about managed choice and basically two questions that would drive around what's driving capacity. Number one, are we having any difficulty getting Montessori certified teachers? Number two, is this school still an overchosen? Is this one of those schools still that families who make it their first choice school are turned away at kindergarten?
So, do you want to start, Chief Strickland?
Commissioner Powell, so yes, managed choice does drive some of what happens at Montessori, unfortunately. I will say that they have had an increase in teacher regular schools, which are actual classroom positions. We have placed additional pre-kindergarten classrooms at Montessori. And then to further make sure that we get the staff Montessori trained, there are funds that are identified in ARP that are going to make sure that we put the resources into the program that it truly deserves.
So we do have classrooms that don't have Montessori certified teachers in them right now?
It is correct. We do have a Montessori coach at the school, and the Montessori coach does actually work closely with the administrators to identify teachers who are lacking in some of those, the pillars of Montessori. And I know that the principal definitely has great systems in which those individuals they are seen by the coaches, and that's really it.
Because that's always been what limited its size. The board, when it approved Montessori as a model, always envisioned it to be a highly chosen school, and that it would be big enough to accommodate everyone that chose it. But I think we regularly get poached by the other Montessori schools in the outside the city, like Webster, and I'm not sure how many other Montessori models there are out there. But is it still true, though, that families start at Montessori and then drift away into other schools as they approach the 4th, 5th, and 6th grades? Or is it more a case of moving away out of the city? Is there still attrition going from the kindergarten level up to the terminal grade, which is 6th grade?
Typically, those that start in the Montessori program stay. There are often times where folks want to get in and hadn't started in the Montessori model, so that becomes a challenge, but typically those who start in the model stay in the model.
So we don't have empty seats when you get into the higher grade levels?
We do, and it could be several reasons, but typically the desire to start a child in Montessori later in the years is not ideal. Because of the model, it's an ideal model too, but it's because some folks may have moved and a variety of reasons, nothing that we can entirely pinpoint.
Okay. I was just curious if there was any desire or design to expand it, but I also understand that getting certified teachers is a hugely limiting factor. So, okay, thank you.
Yeah, I was gonna, President Elliott, she just has a follow-up on Montessori.
Right. Because at one point when we were over there last year or a year before, there was not fidelity to the model. And so the question becomes, are we making the decision that we're going to ensure budgetary-wise that we are being, there is fidelity to that model? Do we have the resources in there for Dr. Harris to implement the model with fidelity.
So currently in the budget, the A funds, which we have in front of us, they do support a Montessori coach. And as I stated before, currently a lot of our programmatic enhancements are located in ARP and the American Rescue Funds to make sure that those teachers have the training that are available for them so they can attend conferences, get professional development, extra teacher pay to devote that time so that they're trained on the pillars of Montessori.
So there's another question that's not budgetary related, but it's related to PK, and I'll ask that offline, because, you know, we want to make sure that, again, there's the fidelity to the model. So I'll talk about that after.
Thank you. Commissioner Simmons?
Yeah, there was a question posed earlier around building subs, and this may not necessarily align directly, but it got me into substitute teachers, and then it prompted a thought around teachers on leave, right? And so I'm curious to know, like, we may not have an exact number, maybe this is follow-up, but how many teachers do we have on leave in this district, right? As far as, it may be personal, it may be medical, it could be disciplinary, but how many teachers do we have on leave in the district, and how do we project or plan for those leaves? Because I would assume if a teacher's on leave, they're still getting paid their salary, be whatever reason they're on leave. And then we have substitutes as well. So how do we kind of reconcile that and budget-wise? How does that work? And can you answer how many we might have?
Not off the top of my head,
Yeah.
right? You know, because
I didn't think so.
that changes today, and
Right.
it changes tomorrow, right? You know, so especially when
do
we
we have
come
an
to
average?
medical leaves, I could get that number and absolutely share it in terms of who the number on each leaves, right? We could definitely get that information to share. Some of those we could plan from. Some of those are unpaid leaves. Some of them are paid leaves, right? Some are different, but there is union obligation money, leave obligation that we have in the human capital budget that covers those costs as we move forward. So there is some projections and built-in costs. And Sean, is there anything else there around that I'm missing? No. So, yeah, there's projected costs that we project out and then we use for leave expenses. But the number fluctuates. We're seeing, obviously, more increases in leaves now than in years coming. And I would say that's nationwide, right? You know, people are going out on leave more frequently.
Yeah, that's kind of the thought process, that there's a trend, and we know there's a shortage and all of these type of things, and so there's this trickle effect. And so I'm just wondering if we're changing any of our budgeting positioning to accommodate this influx.
The budgeting for subs is really based on past history. So most of the subs are the result of short-term. Either somebody calls in, or somebody is sick for a week, or has a medical issue that's short-term, 1 or 2 weeks. Yeah, I don't have the number right offhand of the number of people who are actually on longer-term either medical leaves or whatever leaves rationale there is behind that. But we have challenges. We have challenges providing on a daily basis the subs. So that's not a budget issue. That's a human resource issue of just having enough people to call in, combined with the shortage of teachers on top of that. So, but budgetarily, we're looking at the resources that we're currently expending, and then we project that out for the budget so that we have enough money in the budget to cover that issue if we're able to fill all the subs.
I just want to add, Commissioner Simmons, we can also have that added for Human Resources Committee, to have our HR person give us like that, I don't want to say bird's eye view, but yeah, bird's eye view, and also a view on like absenteeism and percentages, just so that we have an understanding of like the trends, what it looks like, and what it could potentially look like as we move forward. And I just want to uplift too that it is just a struggle in education, and hopefully our state folks also start paying attention that people are leaving, because the state also brings a lot of requirements and standards, a lot of unfunded mandates that schools then have to do. And it is not easy being a teacher and having to constantly change left and right, you know, where you're supposed to be teaching. And now this year's new standards, new mandates. So I just want to put that out there, that I hope all our electeds at all levels are listening, because you know, if we don't change, we're not going to have any teaching force in any school district in any state. So I just want to put that out there. Commissioner Malloy.
So this is a question that's more for the future budgets, but I'm just looking at each school and the CURSA or ARP positions that are listed. And forgive me if this is really simplistic, a question. What happens in the future then when we don't have that funding anymore? Does that mean, do we still need those positions in schools, or how are we going to pay for them? Sorry if that's simplistic.
No,
I'm worried here, and I wonder what the dollar amounts are per building for each of those positions and what the impact is going to be on students.
So that's a real question and a real struggle that we're, you know, and this is, you're hearing this across the state, you're hearing this across the country about what is going to happen now, right? And I do want to say, you're also adding, for us, we became fully funded with foundation aid. So we had an additional $49 million in our budget this year as well. So you add the additional 49, well, let me rephrase it, when the governor approved the budget, right? Is this working? Okay, it's on. Yeah, it's on. Yeah, thank you. So we have the additional 49 million, plus then you have 220 positions or so approximately in CURSA that we're going to have to evaluate and then make some decisions on what stays and what doesn't. Right? That's the reality. That's what I've been saying around our 24 and 25 budget process. Now is this budget 23-24, although, you know, a lot of numbers, a lot of things moving back. The ARP lines are empty next year. The CURSA lines are empty next year. And it's, you know, title, general fund, special aid fund that we're going to have to budget this district off of. And we're going to have to make some decisions on resources. And that's where, you know, and this is where Dr. Jowell's been pushing us and pushing the district on program evaluation, right? What are you going to keep? What are you not going to keep? And we have, you know, the board approved a contract for Gibson several years back, beginning several months ago, and we're starting to evaluate programs. And we're going to have to make some decisions about what 24-25 looks like. It's not going to be an easy 24-25 budget. I'll keep on saying it now. It's not going to be easy decisions for us to make as a collective community, a collective board, and administration.
Thank you.
And with that, that concludes Budget Deliberations Part 2. Please join us next week. Just as a reminder, we have a board business meeting tomorrow as well. So it's a week of seeing my colleagues every single night. But we will be back next week with budget deliberations. And I do want to add that I don't recall right now off the top of my head. I know we're covering all the other sections, but I cannot recall if we also put in there the capital improvement, the CIP. So that will also be on the agenda for discussions next week for capital improvement projects. All right, everyone, have a good night. Thank you.